Welcome everybody to RootsTech 2025. We are going to be at this hour uh, looking at the importance of developing research plans. And LaBrenda Garnay Nelson has extensive knowledge about this, and I will let her take it off.
Thank you, Irina. This is just a reminder about the law of copyright. So, I'm going to be talking about genealogy standards. And even though I am a current trustee of the Board for Certification of Genealogists, and I did serve 3 terms as president of the Board for Certification of Genealogists, I am not speaking on behalf of genealogy, but I am going to base a lot of what I'm saying on the genealogy standards, the book titled Genealogy Standards, which is still the only comprehensive compilation of best practices in the field of genealogy. So this is our starting point. I'm going to begin with an overview of the 10 specific genealogy standards for planning research. And these are standards 9 through 18. And I should mention that these standards are widely used in the genealogy community. They're not just for those who are applying to become for the certified genealogist credential. These 10 standards are augmented by the rubrics developed by BCG for measuring whether the standards are met or unmet. And I'm going to review some of the guidance added by the rubrics related to particular standards. But you should note that all of the rubrics are interrelated. After providing the overview, I'm going to go through a detailed example of how these standards can guide the planning of research. And again, just as a reminder, for purposes of preparing a portfolio for evaluation by BCG, the application guide, the book titled Genealogy Standards, and BCG's rubrics are the governing documents for determining whether genealogical projects meet those standards. What I will do in this lecture is to express my opinions based on my research experience. So if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So that aphorism has been attributed to many different people, including Benjamin Franklin. But apart from who said it first, it perfectly describes the importance of creating a plan to do genealogical research. Planning research is necessary to meet that very first component of the genealogical proof standard, that requirement of reasonably exhaustive research. So by the end of this session, I hope to have impressed on you the importance of beginning every genealogical problem-solving project with this thought in mind. What's your plan? The objective of planned research is to answer specific questions, and you achieve that by developing a research plan for discovering evidence that will help you to do that. The BCG rubrics add that in addition to identifying logical sources, you must also efficiently prioritize first steps. So even though efficient sequencing has its own standard, that's standard 15, it is also required in order to meet standard 9's requirement of planned research. The rubrics flag issues that could prevent a research plan from meeting standards, and examples include the omission of logical first steps, giving low priority to those steps, or redundant or other unproductive steps. An unfocused research question could also prevent efficiency. Standard 10 spells out the requirements of an effective research question. A focused question is one that is capable of being answered, given the sources available for a time and place. To paraphrase the applicable rubric, your research plan will be less efficient if your research question is not clearly defined and effectively focused. A focused question will help you to stay on track as opposed to engaging in random searches that are less likely to turn up relevant information. Standard 11 provides that plans begin with analyzing starting point information for accuracy. So you have to vet whatever information you have to be sure that your research plan will have a sound basis. And I have an example from my personal research that involves oral history related by my paternal grandmother. So this is a family history book that I compiled before I ever took a genealogy class. And it's a beautiful book, hardcover, archival paper, and library binding. But the information in this book was not always documented in a manner that would meet the genealogical proof standard. Although it is a useful collection of the oral histories and records of the families included. And I encourage everyone to collect that kind of information to preserve what you think you know. So this is the first page of a chapter about my paternal grandmother's family. My grandmother told me that the mother of her paternal grandfather, his name was Richard Neely, that his mother was named Mariah Hood, and that Mariah had a brother whom everyone called Uncle Big Tom. The very first sentence in this text reflects exactly what my grandmother said about the name of her grandfather's mother, my grandmother's great-grandmother. But this sentence is incorrect. Knowing that memories are faulty, the next step after learning about this family lore should have been to look for evidence to corroborate my grandmother's memory. Now, there was an element of truth in my grandmother's recollection, but she was born in 1898, and when I interviewed her over 80 years later, she was sharing information about a great-grandmother who probably died when my grandmother was just a small girl. It turned out that my grandmother did have a great-grandmother whose maiden name was Mariah Hood, and that great-grandmother did have a brother named Tom, but Mariah was her father's maternal grandmother, not the paternal grandmother. Documentation is fundamental to genealogical research, but you cannot assume the veracity of any report without making a supreme effort to document the assertion. Standard 12 reminds us that we need to consider whether there are legal factors, among others, that should be taken into account in developing a research plan and scope. In other words, consider factors that could affect the availability of sources. For example, you may be most familiar with land records in states where the federal government was the first grantor of public land. But if you were researching in South Carolina, you would need to know that the federal government never granted land in that state. The rubrics add that research should extend to sources that might provide additional insights by illuminating or challenging other findings. So I want to give you an example of how legal context can provide background information that sheds light on a document. So this is an excerpt from an 1851 will made in South Carolina. It is the will of Betsy Greer, a, quote, free Negro woman. And she leaves her husband, an enslaved man, to her son. In 1851, in many Southern states, the property rights of a married woman were limited, and she could not even execute a valid will without the involvement of her husband. So one piece of information that the legal background suggests is that this woman was not viewed as legally married. Indeed, before 1865 legislation, an enslaved person in South Carolina could not legally marry anyone, not an enslaved person and not a free person. So this woman would have been treated as a single woman whose property rights were not limited. In any case, we are using a legal document for genealogical research. We want to analyze the record to determine why the document exists, including the legal context in which it was created. And here you might wonder why Betsy Greer held her husband in bondage. And it would be important to know that in most of the historical slave states, by the time this will was written in 1851, private emancipations were severely restricted, if allowed at all. In South Carolina, where this will was executed, it took the approval of the state legislature. So regarding why this will would have been created, there were a couple of reasons. First, because the law did not recognize Betsy Greer's marriage, her children were treated as born out of wedlock. And under South Carolina law at that time, those children were barred from inheriting her property unless she provided for that result in a will. And South Carolina did not change that law about children born out of wedlock until the early 20th century. Also, because the law prevented her from emancipating her husband, transferring his ownership to a child or grandchild, as she provided in this will, was a way of safeguarding her husband. So, how do you identify the sources that are most likely to be relevant to the time and place involved in your research? One approach is to start with records that we learn about from our analysis of starting point information. Standard 13 includes examples of finding aids that could be helpful in identifying sources that are likely to provide relevant information. And the handout lists research guides found in print or online that provide overviews of what is available for a time and place. You have to become an expert about the time and place you are researching in. But also keep in mind that these finding aids should be followed to original records whenever possible. When I am researching in a geographic area that is new to me, I always begin by looking for a family search research wiki because they are vetted and pretty reliable. So we're going to look at a document involving Louisa County, Virginia. And this slide shows a tiny bit of the information you can find in the Family Search Wiki on that county. It includes contact information for the county courthouse and a handy chart showing the starting dates for various vital records at the county level. And the example on this slide shows the National Genealogical Society's Guide to Research in Alabama and other books included in its Research in the States series that offers an overview of a state's history, descriptions, locations, and website addresses of major and lesser known repositories, as well as resources such as information about probate records, colonial enumerations, and state census records. Standard 14 contemplates the use of a wide variety of sources that are likely to provide potentially relevant information. The standard relates to the topical breadth of a plan, and it's different from Standard 12 that focuses on background context. In addition to mentioning types of sources, such as artifacts and oral histories, Standard 14 focuses on topics that these sources might cover, including geography, social customs, occupations, any information relevant to the research question under investigation. There is a great example of the use of topical research in one of his articles that Tom Jones included in his book titled Mastering Genealogical Proof. In the McLean article, Tom cited a book on carpenter's tools as part of his research into the occupations of 3 different men. The reference book provided evidence that supported the merging of those 3 different identities. The sequencing of the steps in a research plan is important. An efficient research plan will give priority to sources of high credibility that are likely to have useful evidence. So the rubric we looked at under Standard 9 also applies to Standard 15. You do not meet standards when you give a low priority to logical first steps. Efficient sequencing also requires some level of knowledge about available resources, which is the information you would need to know in order to meet the standards regarding broad context, topical breadth, and source-based content. As explained in the BCG application guide, when your plan is based on a record, for example, it should include sources that are specific to the area, time period, and subject of the record. Also, the plan should fully identify publications, repositories, and the format, original, in print, or electronic, of the sources you expect to consult. And of course, you also have to take account of any limitations, such as time or the cost of obtaining particular records. So as you follow the preliminary plan, you should be continually correlating new and old information. And new information may call for a modification in the plan. Standard 16 simply reminds you that your research plan will be dynamic, subject to change as you vet the known information and analyze potentially relevant records. The goal is to consult all potentially relevant sources, or at least enough of those sources to assure yourself that you have met the reasonably exhaustive research requirement of the genealogical proof standard. Now, obviously, you can terminate a plan when you think you have met the genealogical proof standard, but you might get to a point where there is no other source to explore and you still fall short of genealogical proof. And in that case, the plan should also be terminated, or at least set aside until new information becomes accessible. So this is an outline for developing a research plan based on the requirements of these standards and included in the handout. And I want you to keep this outline in mind as I demonstrate how the relevant genealogy standards apply to the development of a preliminary research plan based on a single record. Crafting an effective research question begins with the analysis of what is known. So the first step of a research project is to assure yourself that you have a handle on whatever information is already available. What do you know, or what do you think you know? Consider whether there are facts or any facts that need to be verified, or whether you can document unique descriptors of your subject. You need to be able to do that in order to recognize relevant documents. Also, there may be same named individuals in the geographic area who must be distinguished from one another. Once you have analyzed the starting point information, identify what you want to know, keeping in mind that the first research question you tackle may not be the only issue that you need to address before getting to the main question. The next step, especially if you are unfamiliar with the geographic area, is to survey research guides to learn something about the basic resources. Then turn to the task of listing sources that might provide evidence to help answer your research question, including an assessment of the sequence in which the sources should be accessed. So let's look at how we would go about developing a preliminary research plan based on the person named in this 1936 death certificate. The kind of document that someone might present you with only a general question about finding out more about the subject's natal family, parents, or any siblings. The first thing you would do before crafting a more focused research question is to identify and analyze the information found in this record. So let's inventory that information. The decedent named in this 1936 death certificate is Frank Jackson. He died in Louisa County, Virginia. A possible relative with the same surname, Walter Jackson, was the informant for this record. You might also note Walter's place of residence in Shelfer, Virginia, which was also the place of burial. Frank's father was named as Patrick Jackson. Two other pieces of identifying information should be noted. Frank was reported as born in 1845, and under color or race, we see the word colored. So we know that Frank was an African American. Frank's wife's name is given as Louise Jackson, but the informant did not know the name of Frank's mother. And finally, the cause of death is given, and conceivably that information could be relevant to a research question. So it is not enough to identify the information items. You must also engage in some analysis. We may not be able to determine the accuracy of the information in Frank Jackson's death certificate until we can correlate it with other evidence, but we can engage in an analysis that assesses reliability, as well as historical or other background context. And I will say more about context in a moment. A vital record, such as a death certificate, generally is viewed as a credible source. But of course, that does not mean that every information item is correct. So let's look at how one would assess the information contained in Frank Jackson's death certificate. The death certificate contains both primary and secondary information about Frank Jackson. Factors that should be taken into account when assessing reliability of the information. Keeping in mind that you want to base any research question on documented information, you might want to focus on the primary information set forth in the column on the left. A Google search would reveal that Shelfer, both the residence of the informant and the place of burial, is in Louisa County, Virginia. the place of death. So we know the informant was likely at least a neighbor of Frank's. The column on the right lists unknown or what is probably secondary information, because the informant is, it's unknown or probably secondary. The secondary information might be accurate, but also less reliable. For example, it is unlikely that the informant was an eyewitness to the year in which the elderly decedent was born. But the information could be reliable if the informant was a close family member who may have obtained that information directly from the decedent. After analyzing the information that is known, the next step in developing a research plan is to craft an effective research question. What do you want to know? If the research question is adequately focused, it should be clear when the goal is met. You have to be sure that your question is capable of being answered. It can't be so narrow that it is incapable of being answered or is susceptible to more than one answer. An example might be, who was Frank Jackson? The name of Frank's father was reported as Patrick Jackson, but the informant for the death certificate did not know the name of his mother. In this case, the family also provided an undocumented 2-page narrative that some anonymous family member had prepared back in 2001. And that document named Frank's mother as Maria. His year of birth was given as between 1830 and 1835. That narrative also noted that Patrick and Maria had married when she was 19 and he was 21. And I will explain the relevance of those ages in a moment. So one question might be, what was the name of Frank Jackson's mother? The informant has the same surname as Frank, and so you might want to find out whether or how they were related. Louise Jackson is named as the decedent's wife, but in any time and place, a decedent's widow is not necessarily the mother of his child. In this case, the 2-page narrative named Frank's wife as the former Barbara Ann Shelton, and a son named Walter was listed among their children. So, assuming that we can establish that Frank was Walter's father, it does not necessarily follow that Louise was his mother. The other thing to keep in mind is that you are also aiming to identify unique descriptions of Frank, because that will help you to link him to records you might find. So what about contextual clues that could affect the scope of a preliminary research plan? Here we have an African descendant man who may have been born as early as 1830 and who died in Virginia. He may have been enslaved before the Civil War, which would have implications for identifying commonly used sources that should be included in the initial research plan. You would want to start by seeking records in the location where he was found soon after emancipation. Effective research of an enslaved subject would require research of the slaveholding family, and his use of the Jackson surname might point to the identity of a former enslaver. But you would also need to know that you might not find his entire family in a single record if, for example, his parents were enslaved by different people. But if Frank was a free person of color before the Civil War, he may have generated the same kinds of records as a person who was free during that period, such as tax lists or census records. But priority would also be given to records that are unique to free people of color in Virginia, and that would include free Negro registers. But take note that in the first instance, you would treat this research subject in the same way you would do for someone of any ethnicity, starting in the present and tracing back in time in census or other records that document his presence in the county of interest. So let's focus on the question regarding the identification of Frank's mother. The informant for Frank's 1936 death certificate did not know her name, but 65 years later, an anonymous family historian named her as Maria. In view of the lack of documentation for the assertion in that two-page family history, her name may not have been Maria. Let's focus, let me do that again. So on this slide, you can see some of the many resources available to help you learn about the history of and genealogical sources for Louisa County, Virginia. If your research takes you back to a period before 1810, for example, it would be useful to know, as you can read in the NGS Research Guide for Virginia, that the 1790 and 1800 federal censuses for Virginia are, quote, presumed destroyed, except the 1800 population schedule for Louisa County. So the list on this slide is not a comprehensive list of every record with the potential to provide information relevant to our research question. It's meant to be illustrative. We would seek U.S. Census records to locate Frank geographically for the period leading up to his death in 1936. The 1870 U.S. Census was the first to require the enumeration of formerly enslaved people with surnames. So if Frank showed up in a U.S. Census record before 1870, we could fairly assume that he had lived as a free person of color before the enslaved were emancipated. Also, my survey of finding aids pointed to two other record groups that could include the name of Frank's mother. First, Virginia marriage records included a mother's name. Second, because enslaved people could not enter into legal marriages, one of the issues that the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands tackled was, quote, normalizing, end quote, or validating the marital relationships of newly freed African descendant men. All of the historical slave states, including Virginia, enacted laws to confirm the status of committed relationships entered into before the law recognized the relationships as marriages. For Virginia, the Freedmen Bureau marriage records, called cohabitation registers, are particularly rich in genealogical detail and can be found online. So it's not enough to list U.S. Census records. You should have in mind the information you hope to find out, as our list does. You should also assess the relative reliability of the records on your list. There are sources that are less error-prone than others, and they should be given priority. Here, for the period before 1940, the U.S. Census records may be the least reliable because they do not record the informant for information. But for our purposes, they could certainly provide useful information about Frank's geographic location or corroborate information in other records. In any case, you would give priority to original records with primary eyewitness information. You should be as specific as possible in identifying not only the names of the sources you will consult, but also verifying that they are available and where they can be found. It may make sense to prioritize the records that are accessible online or that could be obtained by engaging someone to retrieve the physical record. Preliminary research revealed that Frank was probably enslaved because he was not found in a census before 1870. Frank's age is different on every record that has been discovered. Here you can see the birth years given in census records beginning in 1870. This is the type of new information that might call for a modification in the preliminary research plan. Because our plan is dynamic and we have surveyed all of the basic resources, we know that the range of birth years for Frank implicates another record that might include the name of his mother. Because the children of an enslaved woman belong to her enslaver, the records relevant to an enslaved child would be those created by or with respect to the mother's enslaver. Beginning in 1853, Virginia required county officials to record births, including enslaved children. There is a printed index of slave births extracted from the county registers, and the index is also online. These birth registers include the mother's name, and Frank might be listed with his mother if he was born between 1853 and 1856, one of the date ranges suggested by census records. After refining the list of sources, figure out how to access these records. All of them are accessible online, but the published Virginia Slave Births Index alphabetizes the given names of enslaved children. So Louisa County birth registers had to be searched page by page to see if Frank's birth was registered. Today, you might be able to use the full text search tool on Family Search to see if a record exists. Much of the information in that 2-page family history can be documented, but the information about Frank Jackson's parents proved to be incorrect. This is an 1877 Virginia marriage record for a 21-year-old groom named Patrick Jackson with a 19-year-old bride named Maria. The ages of this couple makes it clear that this is the source for the couple named in that 2-page document. Given Frank's probable birth year, Patrick and Maria Jackson could not have been his parents because they were his contemporaries. Frank himself would also have been 21 years old if he was born in 1856. Now, Frank Jackson was never enumerated in a household with his parents, but at least 3 marriage records provide evidence that Frank's parents were named Patrick and Susan Jackson. The earliest record of a birth year, and therefore the likeliest, is 1854. Suggested by the age of 22 in the 1876 marriage register you can see on this slide, where Frank was probably the informant. So he actually married a year before the couple erroneously identified as his parents. This register also identified his wife as the former Barbara Shelton, as stated in that 2-page family history, and corroborated by marriage records and death certificates for their children. This same register also named Frank's parents as Patrick and Susan, and you can see that on the second line from the bottom of this excerpt. A second marriage record was found for Frank. In 1912, as a 61-year-old widower, Frank wed a widow named Louise Robinson. This was the second record on which Frank named his parents as Patrick and Susan Jackson. There was only a single candidate in the geographic area named Patrick Jackson who was old enough to be Frank's father, and he was enumerated as a 45-year-old in 1870, born about 1825. and as a 54-year-old in 1880, born about 1826. In the Freedmen's Bureau files, you can find a Louisa County register of, quote, colored persons cohabiting together as husband and wife. And on this slide, you see the entry for a 40-year-old freedman, formerly enslaved man, named Patrick Jackson, who provided information about 2 former wives and children. This Patrick Jackson was at or close to the age of the candidate for Frank's father, who was enumerated in Louisa County in 1870 and 1880. He reported that he, quote, had a former wife named Susan Ann, end quote, that she was dead, and that they had 2 sons, one of whom was named Frank. And the other son was listed as something that looks like Galland, which may have been how the scribe heard Golland. A 13-year-old named Golland was in Patrick Jackson's 1870 census household. The last source listed in our preliminary plan was that Virginia birth register that began in 1853. And given Frank's possible birth year and Golland's age in 1870, the birth of either or both of them might have been registered. 2 entries for a slave owner in Louisa County named William S. Fowler provide evidence that Patrick Jackson's first wife, Susan Ann, was likely enslaved by that person. A search of the Louisa birth register for the 1853 through 1866 period, in which Louisa revealed, it revealed only one male child named Frank, born to an enslaved mother named Susan Ann, and only one male child named Golland, born to an enslaved mother who was listed as Susan. Frank was born on September 25th of 1853, and Golland was born on October 10th of 1855. And that younger male was close in age to the 13-year-old Golland enumerated in Patrick Jackson's 1870 household. So this slide shows the entry for Frank. There is a tick mark in the column for colored slave. In the case of an enslaved child, the enslaver's name was listed in the column for the father's name. In the bottom portion, you can see the facing page where William Fowler is listed as the owner, who is also the informant for the information. And you can also see the mother's name noted as Susan Ann, corroborating Patrick Jackson's report in the cohabitation register. So this record not only names Frank's mother, it also provides his exact date of birth. So let's look at one more document. We will focus on evaluating a preliminary research plan based on the record copy of the deed you can see on this slide. The deed was recorded in 1822, and it documents that a man named Dublin Hunter purchased land from a man named James Hunter in Lawrence County in the upstate or back country of South Carolina. The research question is, were Dublin and James members of the same family? They shared a surname. The sources we include in an initial research plan will be determined by the adequacy of our research question, including supporting research questions that may come up as we formulate hypotheses to test, and depending also on what is available for the time and place involved. For example, South Carolina did not begin to require statewide registration of vital records until the 20th century. So it would not be productive to list birth or death certificates in a plan for a research question that involves individuals who were adults in 1822 in South Carolina. Although there might be substitutes for vital records in certain areas, they are far and few between in this upstate area of South Carolina. This question of relationship would satisfy the requirements of Standard 10 in terms of whether the research question is focused enough. We have two clearly described and unique persons, the grantor and grantee, under the 1822 deed. And the question specifies the unknown information that we are seeking. The next step is to analyze the information in the deed. So, based only on the deed, what information is known? The deed does not tell us whether the parties are related, but does provide some clues for further research. The official who recorded the deed was the clerk of the county court and charged with recording deeds to prevent fraud in conveyances of land. And that is information you would discover on researching the title of the official who recorded the deed. And because the deed was recorded so close in time to the date of the transaction, there is a high likelihood that the event was memorialized accurately. Much of the information constitutes primary eyewitness information, including the occurrence of the transaction and the names of the parties involved. The absence of a waiver of dower in a time and place where a married woman would have been required to consent to a disposition of her husband's real property provides negative evidence that James Hunter was probably unmarried at the time of the transaction. Of course, that would not mean that he was never married or that he had no children. So the county where this deed was executed happens to be an area that I know quite well, and I have a number of finding aids in my personal library, including materials found in the vertical files of the local public library, such as this privately published history of the Hunter family. But for anyone who is unfamiliar with resources for South Carolina or Lawrence County, there are the typical finding aids that will give you an overview of what is available. So we are going to evaluate the efficiency of this research plan using genealogy standards 9 through 17 and the BCG rubrics that provide additional guidance. This plan includes 3 record types that are typically included in a research plan: census, land, and probate records. But you would not want to concentrate on those records to the exclusion of other potentially relevant sources. Also, this plan presents a case where vital records were not created on a statewide basis during the time period involved. So it was necessary to seek substitute sources for information normally found in vital records, such as births, deaths, and marriages. In any case, you would give priority to original records with primary eyewitness information. So there are a couple of things I would do differently in the plan we're looking at. In addition to US Census records, evidence of the presence of the parties in this geographic area would also be provided by surviving tax records and any state census records. There are sources that are less error-prone than others, and they should be given priority. Here, probate records are the likeliest source of information about familial relationships. And I would also prioritize court records over sources such as newspaper articles or newspaper notices. And instead of a general reference to court records, the plan should include information about the name of a particular court, such as the equity court, where cases that arose out of probates generally included lots of genealogically relevant information. It is fine if the initial plan only has a few steps, although in that case, it would be even more important to prioritize the sequence for examining the sources listed in the plan. Once you have prioritized a short list of sources to consult, you should be as specific as possible in identifying not only the names of the sources, but also verifying that they are available and where they can be found. Ease of access is also a consideration. For example, probate files for the county involved here are on microfilm in the office of the county probate clerk, but they can also be accessed online at Family Search or Ancestry. You might begin looking at probate records on Ancestry because that site is in the process of indexing all names in a probate file, including heirs and enslaved people. And of course, using Family Search's full text search feature, you might pull up those records, the same records. Because I live in Washington, D.C., especially when I need to do a page-by-page search, I prefer to look at census images at the National Archives because I have found those images to be clearer in many cases. So the deed we examine presents another case where new information could call for a modification of the research plan. The deed did not describe the race of any of the parties involved. Research about Dublin Hunter in deed books revealed other records that identified Dublin Hunter, the only man of that name in that area, as a free man of color. And on this slide, you see a deed of emancipation that provides the information that Dublin Hunter purchased his freedom from James Hunter in 1819 in that same South Carolina county. Now, this information does not answer the question whether they were members of the same biological family, but it does establish that the two had the relationship of a former enslaver and a former enslaved man, and would certainly call for a reevaluation of the preliminary research plan. For example, given the 1819 date of this deed of emancipation, you would not expect to find Dublin Hunter's name as a head of household in U.S. Census records before 1819. Although you might end up with a similar list because, for example, enslaved people were counted in every U.S. Census, even though they were not named. And the probate files of enslavers are rich sources of genealogical information about the enslaved. So that ends my prepared remarks. This is my presenter contact information. I want to remind you to please give feedback in the app on this lecture. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
LaBrenda, we're so grateful for all this insight into how proceed from preliminary research and validating and verifying and prioritizing sources. It was very thorough and we're very grateful for that. We now have a couple of minutes for questions. I have here a question. Miss Garrett Nelson, reference text records on slide 47. Did that mean just property tax records, or is it there a way to access income tax records?
Well, for that time period, I am referencing property tax records. The only income tax records you might be able to access was for the income tax that was imposed in connection with the Civil War, that were imposed to pay for the Civil War, basically. But generally, when I reference tax records, I am talking about property tax records, which can be substitutes for census records, for example.
In which situations did people get their emancipation from their enslavers? What were the situations in which they could buy their freedom?
Well, this doesn't directly relate to
I know
planning research, but it could be relevant. Before the historical slave states started to restrict the ability to privately emancipate someone, enslavers were free to basically emancipate people on terms of their choosing. There were situations where legislatures emancipated people to reward people, for example, for service during the Revolutionary War. In South Carolina, before 1800, an enslaver could emancipate someone by any writing that showed that he had deliberately parted with his property rights. After about 1800, a deed was required in South Carolina, and it was required to be witnessed by freeholders or landowners in the area and filed in the court. After 1820, the only way an enslaved person could be emancipated in South Carolina was by act of the legislature, and that was true in other states, slave states as well. So it really would depend on where the emancipation was, where the person lived, and the time period.
Thank you. I was wondering, does a research plan always stem from a document?
Not necessarily, and that's why I gave an example of an oral tradition or oral history passed down by my grandmother. That was the basis of a research plan. And as I said, before I ever took a course and knew what I was doing, I just repeated what my grandmother told me as opposed to trying to document this oral tradition. So no, but the research plan should begin with, again, it's very important to start with a focused research question. You don't want to just randomly search for stuff. You don't want to just put a name into a search engine to see what comes up. You want to give some thought to what you know, having a good foundation for going forward and what you need to research to answer the question about things that you don't know, like the example I gave you of finding the name of Frank Jackson's mother. So the short answer to that question was no, it doesn't always stem from a document, but it should stem from a focused research question.
Yeah, it is just really interesting how oral memory changes with time.
No, it just, as I said, there was a germ of truth to that story.
Yes.
But I could find her mother living with her brother named Tom, and on the same estate records with a brother named Tom, with her child who married into my grandmother's family. So all of that could be documented, but it was the wrong grandparent. It was the wrong side of her family.
That's the wrong side. Yes. Yes. We are done with all the questions that we have for now. We want to thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you.
And if people need to reach out to you, they can reach through the chat in Rootstack, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Take care.